The ground cracked like broken porcelain under the July sun, choking Miller's Creek in the worst drought in 50 years. While million-dollar irrigation wells ran dry and generational farms withered into dust, one woman's fields exploded in emerald green. All because of a muddy trench everyone called a joke. The ink on Arthur Penelope death certificate was barely dry when the vultures started circling. Aria Penelope sat in the suffocatingly small office of the Miller's Creek First National Bank, staring at the foreclosure notice sliding across the mahogany desk. Across from her, Richard Caldwell, a loan officer, whose smile never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes, steepled his fingers. "It's a tragedy, Aria." "It really is," Caldwell said, his voice dripping with rehearsed sympathy. "Your father was a good man. But goodness doesn't pay $250,000 agricultural loan. The farm has bled money for 5 straight seasons. The soil is exhausted, the equipment is rusted, and the bank needs its collateral." Aria kept her eyes on the paper. The Penelope farm had been in her family for 4 generations. It was 300 acres of rolling Midwestern hills, once known for yielding the sweetest corn in the county. But years of aggressive tilling, synthetic fertilizers, and unpredictable weather had turned the rich black loam into something resembling pulverized concrete. "I have the life insurance payout," Aria said, her voice quiet but steel-edged. "It's enough to cover the arrears and fund this season's planting." Caldwell sighed, a patronizing sound that made Aria's jaw tighten. "Even if you catch up, how do you plan to survive the summer? The Meteorological Service is predicting a severe El Niño heat dome. We're looking at historic drought conditions. Adrian Abernathy has already made a very generous offer to buy your acreage. He's willing to pay off your debt and leave you with enough to start a nice, quiet life in the city." At the mention of Adrian Abernathy, Aria felt a hot spike of anger in her chest. Abernathy was the corporate titan of Miller's Creek. He owned 3,000 acres surrounding Aria's property, farming it with massive computer-guided combines, endless chemical sprays, and deep-bore irrigation wells that sucked the local aquifers dry. He had been trying to swallow the Penelope farm for a decade, waiting for her father to fail. "Tell Adrian Abernathy he can go to hell," Aria said, standing up and grabbing her purse. "The farm isn't for sale, I'm planting." But as Aria drove her father's battered Ford pickup back to the farmhouse, the reality of her bravado settled like a stone in her stomach. Caldwell was right about one thing: the soil was dead. If she planted corn the traditional way, the impending drought would turn her crops into brittle yellow husks before August. She didn't have the capital to drill a commercial-grade deep well like Abernathy. She had $50,000 left to her name. In modern farming, that was pocket change. That night, surrounded by her father's dusty ledger books, Aria found an old leather-bound journal her grandfather had kept during the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. Inside, amidst fading sketches and weather logs, she found notes on something called water harvesting and contour swales, ancient techniques of shaping the earth to slow down rainwater, sink it into the ground, and store it in the soil itself. The idea was radically simple. Instead of rushing water off the land to prevent pooling, you dug deep level trenches along the natural contours of the hills. When it rained, the water would fill the ditches, seep slowly into the ground, and create a massive underground lens of moisture that plant roots could access during dry spells. It went against everything modern agronomy taught. Modern farming demanded perfectly flat laser-leveled fields, optimized for massive machinery. Ditches meant wasted space. They meant weeds. They meant you looked like a lunatic. The next morning, Aria didn't buy seeds. She didn't buy fertilizer. Instead, she drove to the next county over and hired Declan Royce, an independent heavy machinery operator, with a reputation for a bad temper and a massive battered Caterpillar excavator. When Declan hauled his machinery onto the Penelope farm and unrolled Auria's topographic maps, he pushed his grease-stained cap back and stared at her. "You want me to do what?" Declan asked, chewing on a matchstick. "You want me to chew up 20% of your plantable acreage to dig a 3-foot-deep, 6-foot-wide trench, zigzagging across your entire property?" "Yes," Arya said. "I want it perfectly on contour, level all the way across, and I want the dirt we pull out piled on the downhill side to make a berm." Declan shook his head. "Lady, I get paid by the hour, so I'll dig a moat and fill it with alligators if you want, but you're ruining good farmland. When the spring rains hit, this is going to turn into a mud pit. And what the hell are you going to plant in the leftover space?" "Sorghum and deep-root heirloom corn," Arya replied. "Just dig." By the end of the week, the pristine, albeit barren, rolling hills of the Penelope farm looked like a World War I battlefield. The massive winding trenches sliced through the landscape in bizarre, wavy lines. Word travelled fast in Miller's Creek. By Saturday morning, the regulars at Betty's Diner were already treating Arya's farm as the town's premier comedy show. Adrian Abernathy, sitting in his usual corner booth, sipping black coffee, was holding court. He was a large man, wearing a pristine Stetson and a silver belt buckle the size of a dinner plate. "I drove by the Penelope place yesterday." Abernathy boomed, drawing laughs from the surrounding tables. "Looks like the poor girl completely lost her mind from the grief. She's out there paying union rates to dig a ditch to nowhere. Thinks she's building the Panama Canal in the middle of Kansas." Old man Higgins, nursing a plate of eggs, chuckled. "She ain't put a single seed in the ground yet, Adrian, and it's already late April." "Let her play in the dirt," Abernathy sneered. "By September, the bank will hand that land over to me for pennies on the dollar. I'll bring the bulldozers in, fill those stupid trenches, and show her how real farming is done." Arya heard the whispers when she came in to pick up a takeout order. She felt the eyes burning into her back, saw the smirks hidden behind coffee cups. She walked past Abernathy's table, her boots leaving dusty tracks on the linoleum. "Morning, Arya," Abernathy said, a predatory smile on his face. "Need a loan for a canoe, since you're building a river and all." Arya stopped, looking down at the wealthy farmer. "Focus on your own fields, Adrian. I hear your new well pumps are sucking up a lot of sand lately." Abernathy's smile vanished, a nerve ticking in his jaw. It was a well-kept secret that the local aquifer was dropping dangerously low. Arya walked out her heart, hammering against her ribs. She had burned her bridges. Her bank account was nearly empty. All her hopes were buried in an ugly, zigzagging ditch. In early May, the sky bruised purple, and the spring storms arrived with violent intensity. It wasn't a gentle soaking rain. It was a torrential deluge that dumped 3 inches of water in 2 hours. Arya stood on her back porch, wrapped in a slicker, watching the heavens open. This was the test. Over on the Abernathy farm, the modern laser-leveled fields reacted exactly as they were engineered to. The heavy rain hit the compacted tilled topsoil and immediately sheeted off. Rivers of muddy, nutrient-rich water cascaded down the slopes, overwhelming the county drainage culverts and washing thousands of dollars of Abernathy's expensive synthetic nitrogen straight into the local creek. But on the Penelope farm, the water behaved differently. As the rain sheeted down Arya's hills, it slammed into the first contour swale. The trench quickly filled with muddy water, capturing the runoff. Because the trench was perfectly level, the water didn't flow away. It sat there calm and still, slowly spreading out along the entire length of the hillside. When the first swale filled the water, crested perfectly over the uncompacted berm, and gently cascaded into the second swale further down the hill. There was no erosion. There was no runoff flooding the county road. Arya's useless ditch had just caught and trapped hundreds of thousands of gallons of rainwater. Declan Royce, driving past in his pickup, pulled over onto the shoulder of the highway. He sat in his truck, the windshield wipers slapping furiously, staring at the terraced pools of water shimmering across Aurea's land. For the first time, the gruff operator began to understand what the crazy girl was up to. Over the next 2 weeks, the water in the ditches slowly seeped down into the soil, creating a massive hydrated sponge deep underground. Once the soil was saturated, Aurea finally planted. She didn't use heavy tractors that compacted the earth. She used a lightweight no-till drill, seeding her heirloom corn and sorghum directly into the unplowed earth, flanked by cover crops of clover and radishes to shade the soil. Then the rain stopped, and it didn't come back. June brought a crushing heat wave. The skies turned a pale, hazy blue, devoid of a single cloud. By July, the meteorologists' warnings became a grim reality. A high-pressure heat dome locked itself over the valley. Temperatures soared to 105 degrees and stayed there for weeks. The wind blew relentlessly, carrying a fine, choking dust that coated everything in a layer of despair. The drought had officially arrived, and it was brutal. Across Miller's Creek, panic set in. The shallow wells dried up first. Then the local creeks turned to cracked mud. Farmers scrambled to run their irrigation pivots night and day, fighting a losing battle against the evaporating sun. Adrian Abernathy wasn't laughing anymore. His massive industrial deep wells, which he relied on to water his thirsty, genetically modified corn, were straining. The water table was plummeting. His pumps were working overtime, pulling up muddy, silt-filled water that clogged his expensive sprinkler heads. Worse, because his fields were bare dirt between the rows of corn. The sun baked the soil, evaporating the irrigation water almost as fast as it hit the ground. By late July, Abernathy's corn started to show the telltale signs of drought stress. The leaves curled inward like tight green cigars trying to conserve moisture. The stalks turned a sickly pale yellow. He was burning thousands of dollars in diesel fuel a week just to keep the pumps running, watching his profit margins evaporate into the shimmering heat haze. One sweltering afternoon, Abernathy drove his air-conditioned SUV down the county line road that divided his property from Aurea's. He wanted to see her failure. He wanted to see the weeds taking over her abandoned, ditch-filled wasteland. He needed the validation that he was right. He pulled his truck to the side of the road and stepped out into the suffocating heat. The wind whipped dry dust against his slacks. He walked up to the barbed wire fence and looked over. Abernathy dropped his sunglasses. His breath hitched in his throat. It was impossible. Aurea's farm wasn't a dusty wasteland. It was a dense, jungle-like oasis. Her heirloom corn stood 7 feet tall, the stalks thick and vibrant, the leaves wide and uncurled, reaching for the sun. The sorghum was thriving a deep, rich emerald green that hurt the eyes in the bleached-out landscape. Between the rows, a thick mat of clover covered the ground, acting like a living mulch that trapped the morning dew and shielded the soil from the baking sun. There were no irrigation pivots on Aurea's land. There were no pumps thumping in the distance. Abernathy stared at the deep, grassy depressions of the swales, the ditches he had mocked. They were dry on the surface now, but the vegetation growing in and around them was incredibly lush. He finally understood the physics of what she had done. While his water was evaporating into the air or running off into the creeks, Aurea had injected the spring rains deep into the earth. The roots of her crops had followed the moisture down, tapping into the hidden underground reservoir her ditches had created. She wasn't just surviving the drought, she was defying it. A creeping, ugly jealousy twisted in Abernathy's gut. He looked back at his own dying fields, then at Aurea's thriving oasis. His deep wells were failing. He had $1 million quota to meet for his agricultural buyers, and his crop was burning up. If he failed this harvest, the corporate investors backing his massive operation would gut him. He couldn't let Arya Penelope, a girl he had publicly humiliated, a girl sitting on 300 acres of drought-proof land. Abernathy pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Caldwell. Abernathy barked as the bank manager picked up. I need you to pull the Penelope file again. I don't care that she made her spring payment. Comb through the fine print. Find a zoning violation. Find a water rights infraction. I want that farm locked down and seized before harvest. Abernathy hung up, staring at the emerald green corn swaying gently in the hot wind. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, his eyes dark with desperate malice. If he couldn't buy the farm and he couldn't out-farm her, he was going to take it by force. Little did he know Arya Penelope was watching him from the shade of her porch, a pair of binoculars pressed to her eyes, fully aware that the real war for her father's land had just begun. The second week of August brought a heat so oppressive it felt like a physical weight. The county's weather sirens remained silent, but Miller's Creek was in a state of emergency. Wells were running dry, livestock were being sold off early at a loss, and the local economy was teetering on the edge of collapse. Through it all, Arya Penelope Farm remained a defiant streak of green against a canvas of scorched brown earth. It didn't take long for Adrian Abernathy to make his move. It started on a blistering Tuesday afternoon, when a pristine white county vehicle pulled down Arya's dirt driveway, followed closely by Richard Caldwell's silver sedan. Arya wiped the grease from her hands. She had been repairing an old harvester, and walked out to meet them. Caldwell stepped out of his air-conditioned car, looking wildly out of place in his tailored suit, his eyes darting toward the towering stalks of heirloom corn. Beside him was Gregory Barnes, the county agricultural inspector, clutching a clipboard. "Afternoon, Arya," Caldwell said, though his voice lacked its usual smooth confidence. He looked intimidated by the sheer volume of life surrounding him. "I wish this were a social call." "Spit it out, Richard," Arya said, crossing her arms. Inspector Barnes cleared his throat, pulling a legal document from his clipboard. "Miss Penelope, we've received a formal complaint regarding your earthworks, specifically the contour trenches. According to the Miller's Creek Water Conservation Act of 1982, unauthorized impoundment or diversion of natural watersheds during a declared drought emergency is a Class B misdemeanor." Arya stared at him. "I'm not diverting a watershed. I'm catching the rain that falls directly on my own property. The complaint alleges that your deep swales are artificially altering the subsurface water table." Barnes continued, refusing to meet her eyes. "Because of this, the bank is issuing an immediate cease and desist. You are required to fill these trenches within 48 hours, or you will be found in violation of your loan's property maintenance clauses." "Foreclosure." Caldwell added a hint of a smirk returning to his lips. "If you don't comply, we seize the farm by Friday. It's a liability issue now, Arya." Arya felt the ground tilt beneath her. Abernathy was trying to use the county bureaucracy to force her to destroy the very thing keeping her farm alive. If she brought bulldozers in to fill the swales now, she would crush her own crops and destroy the root systems tapping into the moisture. "Who filed the complaint?" Arya asked, though she already knew the answer. "A concerned neighboring landowner," Caldwell replied smoothly. Arya didn't panic. She didn't yell. Instead, she walked back to the porch, picked up a thick, weathered binder, and dropped it onto the hood of Caldwell's sedan. A cloud of dust puffed into the air. "That is my grandfather's Federal Soil Conservation Charter from 1938. Arya said, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "It grants this specific parcel of land Federal Protection for Experimental Contour Farming, signed by the Department of Agriculture during the Dust Bowl. Federal law supersedes your 1982 county ordinance. Furthermore, under the State Right to Farm Act, you cannot legally compel me to alter a functioning agricultural practice mid-season without a state-level environmental review. Caldwell's smirk vanished. Barnes looked nervously at the binder, then back at the banker. "If you want to take my farm, Richard," Arya said, stepping close enough that he could see the raw fury in her eyes, "you're going to have to drag me through federal court, and I promise you, I will invite every news camera in the state to watch you try to destroy the only green farm in the county." Caldwell swallowed hard, turned on his heel, and got back into his car. Barnes quickly followed. As they drove away, Arya let out a shaky breath. She had won the bureaucratic battle, but she knew Abernathy wouldn't stop there. A cornered animal is the most dangerous, and Abernathy was bleeding money by the hour. 3 nights later, the moon was hidden behind a thick haze of heat and dust. Arya was asleep in her armchair, a shotgun resting across her lap. She had been taking watch every night, trusting her instincts. Around 2 a.m., the low guttural growl of a diesel engine echoed across the lower fields. Arya jolted awake. She grabbed a heavy flashlight, racked a shell into the chamber of the shotgun, and sprinted out the back door. Down in the valley near the property line, she shared with Abernathy a pair of headlights cut through the darkness. It was a heavy-duty skid-steer loader, its steel bucket lowered, driving directly toward her primary retaining berm, the main earthwork that held the master moisture lens for the lower acreage. If that berm was breached, the dry air would penetrate the soil structure, and the carefully preserved subsurface water would bleed out into the cracked earth of Abernathy's barren fields. Arya ran her boots pounding against the soft clover. "Hey!" she screamed, but the roar of the engine drowned her out. Suddenly, a massive set of floodlights clicked on from the county road, blinding the driver of the skid steer. A battered Caterpillar excavator, Declan Royce's machine, was parked sideways across the access gate, blocking the exit. Declan stood on the tracks of his excavator, a heavy steel wrench in his hand. The skid steer slammed on its brakes, skidding to a halt mere feet from the berm. The driver threw it into reverse, panicked, but Declan had already jumped down and marched over to the cab. He yanked the door open and dragged the driver out into the dirt. Arya arrived, breathless, shining her flashlight on the man on the ground. It was Wayne Abernathy's head foreman. "Well, well," Declan growled, planting a heavy work boot on Wayne's chest. "Looks like somebody got lost on their way to the construction site." "He told me to do it," Wayne stammered, raising his hands to shield his face from the light. "Abernathy said to cut the berms. He said it wasn't fair you had water when we were choking on dust." Arya lowered the shotgun, her heart pounding with a mixture of rage and overwhelming relief. She looked at Declan, who gave her a grim, respectful nod. "Call Sheriff Miller," Arya said to Declan, her voice steady. "Tell him we caught a vandal destroying private property, and tell him to bring an arrest warrant for Adrian Abernathy." The arrest of Adrian Abernathy's foreman was the match that lit the powder keg in Miller's Creek. When the local sheriff forced Wayne to give a formal statement, the foreman folded immediately, detailing Abernathy's direct orders to sabotage the Penelope farm. While Abernathy's high-priced lawyers managed to keep him out of a jail cell pending trial, the damage to his reputation was absolute. But the final crushing blow didn't come from the law. It came from the earth itself. By late September, the drought finally broke with a series of gentle, soaking autumn rains. But it was too late for the traditional farms. The harvest season had arrived, and the results were a catastrophe. Across Abernathy's 3,000 acres, his massive $1 million combine harvesters rolled through the fields, churning up choking clouds of dust. The genetically modified corn starved of water, and baked by the sun, yielded a pathetic 30 bushels an acre. The ears were small, stunted, and practically worthless. Abernathy had burned through hundreds of thousands of dollars in diesel fuel and synthetic chemicals, only to harvest a crop that wouldn't even cover the interest on his massive operational loans. Then there was Aria. Because she didn't own a $250,000 combine, she hired a local cooperative to help her harvest. As the old reliable machinery moved through her towering emerald green fields, the contrast was staggering. Her heirloom corn, nourished by the deep subterranean water lenses created by her useless ditches, yielded an astounding 180 bushels an acre. Her sorghum was thick and rich, the deep roots having found exactly what they needed to survive the brutal heat dome. The clover cover crop had fixed natural nitrogen into the soil, meaning she hadn't spent a single dime on synthetic fertilizers. Word spread beyond the county lines. Soon, agricultural researchers from the state university arrived walking her fields with clipboards and soil probes, marveling at the damp, dark earth hidden just below the surface of the swales. The local news stations sent camera crews filming the lush jungle of the Penelope farm standing right next to the barren, dusty wasteland of Abernathy's corporate empire. On a crisp Monday morning in October, Aria walked into the Millers Creek First National Bank. She didn't wear a dress. She wore her dusty work boots, jeans, and her grandfather's old canvas jacket. She bypassed the tellers and walked straight into Richard Caldwell's office. The loan officer looked up, his face pale. He had seen the harvest reports. Everyone had. Aria reached into her pocket, pulled out a certified cashier's check, and dropped it onto the mahogany desk. That covers the arrears, the remainder of the principal, and the penalty fees for early closure, Aria said, her voice echoing in the quiet office. The Penelope farm is officially debt-free. If you ever send an inspector to my property again, Richard, I'll buy this bank and fire you. Caldwell stared at the check, entirely speechless. By November, the financial reality of the drought caught up with Adrian Abernathy. His corporate backers, furious at the catastrophic losses and the looming sabotage scandal, pulled their funding. Unable to service his massive debts, Abernathy was forced to file for bankruptcy. His pristine trucks, his laser-leveled equipment, and his dry, exhausted land went to the auction block. Aria attended the auction. Sitting quietly in the back row, she used a portion of her historic harvest profits to buy 300 acres of Abernathy's foreclosed land, the very acres that bordered her property. The next spring, Declan Royce's heavy excavator was back to work. But this time, nobody at the diner was laughing. Instead, a line of pickup trucks parked along the county road, watching as Declan carved long, beautiful leveling swales into the newly acquired exhausted dirt. Other farmers from the county came leaning against the fences taking notes. They asked Aria about water harvesting, about cover crops, and about how to heal the land they had spent decades punishing. Aria Penelope didn't just save her father's farm, she saved the future of Millers Creek. She proved that true farming wasn't about fighting the land with chemicals, deep wells, and brute force. It was about listening to the earth, understanding its shapes, and catching the rain when it fell. And it all started with a muddy ditch that everyone called a joke. Sometimes the greatest innovations look like steps backward. Aria's story proves that working with nature, rather than fighting it, is the ultimate key to resilience. When the world tells you your ideas are crazy, let your results do the talking. If this story of grit survival and defying the odds inspired you, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder to trust their vision. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible real-life stories.